this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. When we think of the fighting in the Far East between Britain with her allies and the Japanese, we picture thick jungles, impossibly steep hills and dense terrain. It is easy to see it as an infantryman's war. But armour was successfully deployed in the theatre. For this episode, I'm joined by Jack Bowsher, whose book, Forgotten Armour, starts with a failure to fully mechanise the interwar Indian Army, then traces the development of armoured training, logistics and tactics. Once tanks have arrived in the theatre and bunker-busting methods were devised, armour proved decisive in their encounters against the Japanese and saved countless Allied lives. Well, Jack, thanks for joining me. Let's start with a look at the Indian and British armies in the Far East. Before the war, pre-war, the Indian Army can be seen as a colonial police force or undertaking internal security duties. It also needed to defend the northwest frontier. Had there been a move to mechanise the Indian Army and introduce tanks and armoured vehicles before the war?
Well, yeah, they do look at how they're going to mechanise the Indian Army as a whole, and they do start to mechanise it. It's worth saying that tanks are basically the last thing, and they don't get mechanised in time for the beginning of the war. Everything else is actually motorised, might be a better way to describe it. And it's the armour that's the missing link. There are British units like the Royal Tank Regiment and so on. They do go out to India, and they do in the late 20s and 30s. There are examples of tanks being used, but we're talking about the little Carden Lloyd tankettes. We're not talking about large scale things. The big problem that they find is that whenever they've tried to do that, whilst they show promise, they still don't have the off-road capability that they would like. And so they end up being tied to roads. And then that becomes vulnerable to, say, Afghan tribesmen. So like they will be using the roads to resupply tanks further forward. And then, horsemen can then attack the lorries that are bringing up the supplies for the armour, spare parts, the stuff that can't be carried any other way, quite easily. And so then you start having to use tanks to patrol up and down the road, taking away from the fact that they're supposed to be at the front fighting. And then you get problems with the hills and mountains and so on. They do use them in a couple of places, and they are reasonably successful because they're impervious to fire. But there's still this nagging sense of just anything that tank can do can be done slightly better on a horse. And that being impervious to fire, i.e. the armour of a tank, is not important enough to make that more worthwhile. So it keeps being delayed for the sake of money at the end of the day. It's an easy thing to put off because they just don't think they need it.
Well, I couldn't help but think as well when you were talking about that, the logistical problem in India must be, India's huge. So you start, all right, we need trucks to move our parts. Okay, well, we need roads to put the trucks on. Well, that's all right. It's rained. The roads have gone, right, it doesn't work well as your horses, mules, other things keep moving.
It's worth saying that most of it will be moved by rail as close to the front line as you can get it before you're then using these lorries and so on. The bigger problem actually is that there aren't a lot of roads, and so the Royal Engineers then have to end up building it, and it's a greater logistical headache, and your more and more mouths are being at the front end and things like that. And again, we're back at that point where is it worth the effort when a horse can do it much more easily without building a road behind it or in front of it?
I think most people, when they think of Burma, they think of thick jungle, steep hills. I thought there was a Michael Caine film, but I think that's actually about Malaya, isn't it? It's in my head.
Are you talking about Too Late the Hero?
Yeah, probably.
It's one of the it's a new Britain or something like that. It's slightly off. I mean, that's a Vietnam film anyway. Right?
Exactly. Right? It was so in my head, and I'm going, I'm sure that's wrong. I did mean to look it up. But I wondered in Burma, I mean, is there a large armoured force available to the British when the Japanese attack it's this December 41? Did they cross the border in December 41 or January?
So they crossed border in December 41. But the main assault, so they cross over into Tenasserim, which is that little bit of Burma that sort of stretches down towards Thailand, really, really thin bit of land. There, they cross over to that at the beginning, and then the main assault on a town called Moulmein, which has airfields that are within range of Rangoon. That's when the main assault starts in January. So there's like incursions in December 41.
So do the British are the British aware? Well, the British should be seeing some sort of offensive happening. Are they moving tanks down to the border? Can they bring them in from anywhere? I mean, I'm not sure if they felt they were even necessary.
So they do feel that they want to bring some tanks there, but it's Malaya. Again, we mentioned Cardinal Lloyd tankettes. There are a few light tanks in Malaya, but they don't do very well at all, mostly because they are vulnerable to what the Japanese have available. And we'll talk about anti-tank capability, I think, later. So they're pretty much disastrous there. And like everything else, the troops are either killed or they go into the bag. When the crisis begins, the British send the 7th Armoured Brigade, who have done very well in North Africa. They've had a few incidences where they've taken casualties charging German anti-tank gun screens. But generally speaking, they've given both the Germans and the Italians bloody noses. They were part of the operation that captured Fort Capuzzo, for example. They fought at Sidi Rezegh. They are moved out to the Middle East with the intention of going to Malaya. But it's when they're at Sri Lanka having a sort of a stop-off, they're given a couple of days leave in Sri Lanka, that the decision is basically made. Malaya is a lost cause. The threat now is Rangoon. And so they're diverted to Rangoon. And even then, by the time they get there, it's kind of already too late. So there are no real armoured units ready to go. It's reinforcements coming from the Middle East. But even then, by the time they arrive, it's already too late. So to put this in perspective, the Sitang Bridge disaster. So for the listeners, this is when the British 17th Division in particular is fighting withdrawal out of that bit of Burma, Tenasserim, the finger that goes down towards Thailand. They've withdrawn up that sort of area there to the Bilin River. They fight a rearguard action on the Bilin River, which they bloody the Japanese at this stage, but it's not decisive. At the end of the day, they are still outflanked. They still have to move back. And as they're retreating to the Sitang Bridge, they're withdrawing troops across. And the basic problem is that they blow the bridge with one of the brigades still on the wrong side of the river. And so some of them are captured, some of them are killed trying to cross, some of them survive. And it's at that point that the 7th Armoured Brigade are being unloaded at Rangoon docks. Firstly, 17th Division is under strength because it had lost brigades to Malaya. So they'd taken brigades out of it to Malaya and it had received reinforcements, but it wasn't up to full strength. There's also the 1st Burma Division, similarly under strength, but didn't lose so many men because the 17th Division were guarding the flank as the 1st Burma Division came across. So they have to completely reconstitute themselves. The 1st Burma Division go slightly north of the Sitang to guard the valley, the Sitang Valley. And the 17th Division are pulled back to Pegu, which is just the other side of the Sitang Bridge. And it's there that they receive the 7th Armoured Brigade support because they're so weak they need to rest. So the 7th Armoured Brigade sort of plugs into the line with their own infantry support that has come with them from the Middle East. And they're having to then just defend first Rangoon, so give 17th Division time to re-equip. The 17th Division have sent soldiers into department stores in Rangoon to find clothes for the soldiers that had dumped their clothes to swim across the river, to find them shoes, things like that to wear. This is how badly mauled the 17th Division are. Luckily, a lot of them brought their weapons out, but there were stocks in Rangoon to replenish, although not so much on the heavy weapons side. And the 7th Armoured Brigade are just trying to halt the Japanese as best they can for a few days. But this is also when the Japanese do the classic infiltration tactics that we always hear about. And so they get behind the 7th Armoured Brigade and parts of 17th Division. They have to break out of a roadblock. They then retreat on Rangoon. Then they go north of Rangoon to Towkyung because they realise they can't hold Rangoon. They have to break through another roadblock, which is near where the Rangoon cemetery is today, Towkyung British War Grave, the Commonwealth War Grave is. They have to break through a roadblock there. And it's this fighting retreat where they're constantly having to break through roadblocks. And it's sort of the tanks that are helping push through those.
Had they had any specific retraining, I guess, coming from the Middle East? The Middle East is a very different environment. It's all right just to get 7th Armoured and put them on ships and ship them over. But do they get any? I mean, presumably it's a different environment, so the tanks need to be potentially set up differently. It's a very different. Your line of sight's potentially going to be a lot different from the desert. You can't just drive anywhere. Are they prepped before they arrive on? This is how we think we need to be fighting. Is there any doctrine to follow? Have the Indian Army come up with anything? Well, they didn't really have tanks, so they wouldn't have really had a lot of thought about it.
No, they don't. There are two issues here. Firstly, is they were planning to go to Malaya, which was going to be jungle fighting. This is still the stage of the war where the British kind of haven't really quite realised, we need to change everything that we're doing at this point. So an example would be, I mentioned the having to break through roadblocks, the Japanese getting behind them, the doctrine of breaking those roadblocks. That's what will be undone by Slim, a year later, because the over-reliance on roads, the reliance on tracked transport all the time in these kind of environments, that's the doctrine. They haven't had time to change that. They haven't learned a drastic enough lesson to change that yet. They're in the middle of that process of learning that lesson, because obviously the disaster at Malaya is one thing, but the disaster at Burma is still to come. They're probably already at a point where they could learn that lesson, but they're in no way capable at this stage of acting on that. So the 7th Armoured Brigade arrive, and what they're doing is they are just having to react. Slim describes them at one point in Defeat into Victory as they're like his fire service. They're a firefighting service. He just has to send them where they are most desperately needed. And this is why they're so important as well, is because whenever there's the biggest threat to the British and Indian forces, it's the 7th Armoured Brigade that is sent to fix it. So when one unit is resting, having been got out of a roadblock by 7th Armoured Division, the 7th Armoured Division is then redeployed to wherever the next emergency is. And that happens again and again and again over the months. But they don't have the time to learn anything. Everything is on the fly. Everything is on the hoof. The way that they attack Japanese roadblocks, when they try to break out of a roadblock near Prüm, a place called Schweigen, when they try to break out there, one of the infantry columns that has gone out into the jungle gets lost and no one sees it for another 12 hours and has completely missed the battle that it was supposed to be taking part in. The other infantry battalion going the other side of the road, because they were trying to hook behind a Japanese roadblock. That one does actually manage to take part in the fighting. But the other one, like I said, is completely lost until it turns up, half a day later, having not really done anything and realised the battle was already over and having to pull themselves up.
What tanks do they arrive with? My assumption is they don't necessarily want to be shipping to the Far East the best tanks the British Army's got because they're desperately needed to fight the Germans. So they're getting second-rate vehicles, or what have they been sent with?
Well, it's interesting, actually. They were given the Stuart tanks, even though the soldiers didn't know this, but they were sent down to, I've forgotten the name of the camp now. There was a special camp near the Red Sea, near one of the ports further south. Can't remember what one it is, where there was a British Army base that had American troops there for doing the conversion courses on Stuart tanks. And the reason it's there is because the Battle of the Atlantic, they're sending a lot of the reinforcements to the Middle East through the Indian Ocean, because that's not a combat zone until December 1941. So a lot of the stuff sent from America to Egypt on the Red Sea. Might be Port Said, but the camp I'm talking about is near there. They are bringing them in there, but they then are having conversion training onto Stuart tanks, but then they're loaded straight onto the ships and sent back in the opposite direction to Malaya. So yes, it's the Stuart light tanks, the one with the little cupola on the top of it. I haven't cut that off yet.
And how does that compare to what the Japanese have? I mean, do they have any tank-on-tank action in that Japanese invasion of Burma?
No, not really, because what happens is sort of the retreat through Burma happens in two different valleys. So there's the more famous one because there's more dramatic fighting, and frankly, to British historians, it's where the British and Indian Army does the bulk of the fighting. Chinese reinforcements with the 1st Burma Division fight through the Sitang Valley, which is further east, and that's where the Japanese send their tanks, mostly because they just don't rate British fighting ability. So the British have 7th Armoured Brigade and the 17th Division, which is weaker, fighting up the Irrawaddy Valley, which is to the west, with a mountain range between them. So it's like if it's sort of two fingers pushing north from Rangoon, there's the eastern one, Sitang Valley, the Chinese and the 1st Burma Division are going that way. So the Japanese push that one. And there's a big reason for that. The Japanese want to push up the Sitang Valley quickly and capture Mandalay from that direction, which will cut off the British troops further south at Rangoon and in the Irrawaddy Valley. Luckily, things like the Chinese troops do fight, despite quite poor equipment themselves, and also they still have quite a lot of German equipment that they bought in the 1930s. So you do still see the occasional photograph where they're wearing Stahlhelms or the German field caps, things like that, fighting against the Japanese. But they fight very, very bravely, and so they are successful to a degree in delaying Japanese advances, whilst the British are doing the same in the Irrawaddy Valley with the remains of the 17th Indian Division and the 7th Armoured Brigade. They will then join up later when they cross the Irrawaddy at Mandalay, or just south of Mandalay. So everything joins up together eventually. But by then again, it's just too late. The Chinese cross back into China, apart from one unit.
So were the Japanese not using tanks at all?
Sorry, they're using a small number in the Sitang Valley.
It's just a swift. I mean, it's what, 800 miles of British retreat, but it happens so fast. You kind of think, is it some sort of Blitzkrieg-esque Japanese version of German tank warfare?
It's infantry based. It's a light infantry force. I mean, the interesting thing about the Japanese army is that really it's a First World War outfit with a few bells and whistles that have been added in the 30s. And by far the biggest example would be if you take the French army at the beginning of the First World War, where sort of vigor and energy and boldness in elan. That's the word I was looking for, because that's the word they will use. Elan in the attack, the bayonet charge. That's one of the things that the Japanese have taken on because it fits perfectly with Bushido. It's that exact same thing. Your infantry will overwhelm the enemy if you just fight vigorously enough. And that works in 1941. What will be the long-term shortcoming to that is that when we get to later in the war, the Japanese will still be using that. They'll still be using things like 37mm and 47mm anti-tank guns when the British and Indian units are equipped with Grant tanks and Sherman tanks, which the 47 and 37mm will not penetrate the frontal armour. They will possibly penetrate the side armour at very close range. They will probably, at the rear, penetrate the rear armour. So basically, you have to be at close range and in the perfect spot to destroy a British or Indian tank. And because they've not updated that technology, tanks will become more and more and more important as the war goes on in the Far East.
Once we're out of Burma, that sort of line stabilises along what's the river? Chinwin. I was going to say Irrawaddy, but the Chinwin. Do more tanks start to arrive for the British? At which point I was wondering, again, I was coming back to the infrastructure problem and the logistics problem. Does this become a problem of the more armour starts arriving? Do we have to find more Indian drivers? Is it the Indians doing the logistics? Royal Army Service Corps, Royal Indian Army Service Corps?
Yes, yeah. Yes, it is that. And this is the thing, is that the Japanese, we have to remember, the Indian Army massively expands. So it starts at just under 200,000, and by the end of the war, it's 2.5 million. It's incredible how vast the change is. And so the early recruits they struggle because it's it's one of the reasons why the retreat in Burma happens, because it's not just the fact that the Japanese overwhelm them and they have the initiative essentially because they're the attacking force, and they use hooks through jungle that everyone thinks is impassable. But it's also the fact that the training for those Indian soldiers in particular, has been so shortened, and the milking of experienced Indian soldiers and spreading them out into new units has also been was actually in hindsight a bad move. They should have kept strong experienced units together and had inexperienced units serve alongside them, rather than cutting up those experienced units and distributing them liberally, because then it meant that every unit was green rather than strong units aside weaker ones. But no, what happens is, because the armour in the retreat had shown promise, the only reason that no tanks get out is because they just don't have time to get them across the Chindwin when they retreat. One tank gets out, which famously goes back in 1945, called the Curse of Scotland, a Stuart tank from 7th Armoured Brigade. It crosses over as a test to see if they could reasonably get one out. It's sent ahead of the retreat. Just go back to infile. We want to know if it's possible. And they basically report back and say, we got here, but it was such a problem. They spent 12 hours trying to cross the Chindwin, making a raft and then refixing it when it nearly sunk and things like that. They realised it just wasn't practical. And so they abandoned the tanks on the Chindwin. There's this amazing scene, actually, I think, and I recount this in the book. A lot of the soldiers are really disappointed to be leaving the tanks behind, and the infantry as well, because everybody realizes how much they've done to get the troops out. And they then have to smash them up. And like, there's a brilliant thing where one of them talks about how they got all the oil out, they drained all the oil, and then ran the engines at full revs so that it would seize the engines. And they couldn't believe how long the engines could run without oil. And like, one of them comments, the tanks didn't want to die, they wanted to come out. They didn't want this punishment, sledgehammers on the barrels to make sure the guns were unusable as well. But yeah, because they've been so successful in the retreat, considering the situation they were in, an emergency force, no training, no change in doctrine or anything like that, and yet they successfully break through multiple roadblocks. The big thing they do is they give infantry units that are battered time to get away before they're destroyed. That basically they've shown this promise, so the experiment is continued. So new units come out. So again, for 1944, most of the tank fighting will be done by British units, which we'll come to in Far Kohima, because the Indian units aren't raised and trained, having learned the lesson that you can't rush training. So the Indian tank units fight in 1945 predominantly. There are exceptions, but predominantly they fight in 1945. The promise has been shown in 1942. There's a big failure during the first Arakan operations in 1943, but that was seen as a problem really by the fact that they were rushed forwards too early, really, and in too small numbers. They sent 2 troops to try and break the position at Dombak.
That Arakan offensive, that's when the British go back on the offensive, isn't it? That first Arakan. Is that part of... We were discussing the learning curve. It's such a great phrase that gets used. Is that part of the learning curve for the British and Indian forces? Did they have to go through that? And what's learned?
The reason they go to Arakan is because it's the most logical way of using Allied advantages that they think they have. So they start making plans to do amphibious hooks. So the Arakan, for those that don't know, is a coastal region. And so the idea would be is that you would do skips and hops with amphibious landings to get to... Well, the first plan actually is to just do one big amphibious landing near Rangoon. They don't have the shipping for that. So then the idea is, well, because we're coastal minded, we're going to push down the coast again, easy to resupply for us by sea. We can use smaller hops with less shipping to get behind Japanese positions, but they still don't have enough even for that. So it's like, well, okay, fine, we'll just push over land. So they kind of end up path dependency. Path dependency would be the sort of academic phrase. They want to do a big amphibious landing. Well, you can't do that. Okay, we'll do smaller amphibious landings over shorter distances. Still can't do that. Well, we're on the coast anyway, so we'll just push down the coast. The problem is it does mean there's no flank to one side. Resupply can be easier, but because they don't want to rely on that, and especially in 1943, the Japanese, they still haven't got entirely secure control of the Bay of Bengal from Japanese shipping, from Japanese attack. So they end up building, so it's 14th Division under Noel Irwin. They push down the Arakan and they build a road behind them. And they're moving at such a snail's pace because he doesn't want to outstrip his building of his road. The Japanese rush reinforcements. I say rush reinforcements. We're talking about a company is at this village called Dombak. And they build a series of about 7 or 8 bunkers across a dried up riverbed, which in monsoon is like a raging torrent from the mountains. It has some coastal tidal water gets in on the coastal edge of it, but it's dried up for most of it at the period we're talking. The Japanese build this position overlooking this chum. 7 or 8 bunkers. They've got bunkers in the hills overlooking it as well. And it's like a First World War battle. The 14th Division just bangs its head against it. And sort of this is like 1915 of the First World War. And the idea is, Irwin just says, well, more men, more artillery. And he just keeps trying the same thing over and over again. And in the end, and Slim is his corps commander. What's interesting here is that Slim is supposed to be in charge of this corps-sized operation because 14th Division isn't the only division involved, but it's the key one. But because Slim had sacked Irwin's friend in East Africa in 1940, he decides to take control of the operation even though he's the army commander. And he leaves Slim to just train troops. So when Irwin is panicking, and I think he panics, because he can't break this thing, it's one Japanese company who is guarding Dombak, and he can't break through it. It's completely unimaginative. And he wants to bring up tanks. And so he says, Slim, send me, 2 troops of the 146th Royal Armoured Corps. They're Valentine tanks. And Slim basically says, "Are you sure?" Because Slim had previously written a memorandum saying, the more you use, the fewer you lose. Always use overwhelming force, the Clausewitzian thing. He thinks send the whole regiment, not 2 troops. So they send 2 troops in the HQ from C Squadron of 146th Royal Armoured Corps. And Irwin throws them in. They arrive in the evening. It's already dark. They do a on-foot reconnaissance of the Donback Chung. They can't really see anything. They're told, "Oh yeah, the bunkers are there. Don't worry, you'll be able to find them." And so the next morning when they go into the attack, the 2 mistakes they make is firstly that poor reconnaissance. The second one is that they make this plan where the infantry, I can't remember what the infantry battalion is now, they push up into the hills overlooking it, and then they will come down from the hills and then assist clearing the Chung. And they will join the tanks in the attack. And so the infantry and the armour are almost doing 2 separate operations and intend to join halfway through the operation, which is ridiculous. They can't fight like that. You must have infantry and tank fighting together. You can't assume that the infantry can do a job in one place, bearing in mind they've already failed in multiple attacks at this point. So why are they suddenly going to be able to do any better this time without changing anything? And then link up with the tanks, who at this point have no infantry support. And so what happens is the infantry go into the attack in the hills. They get bogged down. They decide, well, we need to send the tanks in anyway. Remember, I think Irwin is panicking. So the tanks move forward under Captain da Costa. And the first troop basically approaches the Chung. And because they've not done any detailed reconnaissance, they don't realise quite how soft the ground is. The way to think about it is that, this is right at the end. This is for the geographers out there. This is the floodplain from the Arakan Mountains. So it's very sedimentary sort of soil. It's sandy and things like that. It's not very solid ground. It's all the deposited sand and silt from the river has deposited it. And so as the first troop approach this Chung, the ground gives way and they slide into the bottom of the Chung. And they're basically never seen again. Da Costa goes back in 1945 with the Graves Registration Unit, and they find one of the Valentine tanks that there are the remains of British soldiers who haven't been moved from 3 years earlier, decomposed, on and around the tanks. They've tried to evacuate the tanks and been killed in the crossfire because the bunkers were directly above them on the far side of this Chung. One of the Valentine tanks has basically landed on top of the one in front because none of them could see into the Chung. So one of them gives way and falls in. And so the others just follow because that's their troop commander. But all 9 of the Valentine tank has 3 crewmen. And the thing is that what they've done, the other troop and the HQ troop behind that, they then stay above the Chung a little bit further back. But they're having to move at a right angle. They follow the route of the Chung. So the driver is facing forward whilst the commander and gunner are facing 90 degrees to the left. And they're firing at what they can see, but it's like the crews are overworked in a Valentine tank. The crew is too small. So they're attacking these Japanese bunkers and they can't really see them very well. They have vague ideas. There's the odd flash, but also they've only got armor piercing shot in the 2-pounder in the Valentine. So all they're doing is, unless they get a direct hit on the machine gun or they literally hit the crewman behind it with a 2-pounder armor piercing round, they're not really able to destroy the bunkers. Not that they can see them particularly. No infantry has turned up. The infantry up in the mountains, are still stuck up there. And so there's further damage. One of them has like a fuel line hit. The smoke discharger explodes. And so there's a big pall of smoke. They basically end up driving all the way through down to the end of the Chung. They get nowhere. The infantry don't turn up. 2 of them end up being abandoned a few miles behind and recovered later after they pull back. And it's been a complete failure. There's a real, like I said, the learning curve moment, but there's a fork in the road here. Is this 1 2-troop sized tank attack going to be an ultimate failure and we'll never use tanks in Burma again? Or was there something we did wrong with tanks? Now, the lucky thing perhaps is because Irwin tries to blame everyone around him, including Slim, who, remember, he's effectively relieved Slim of command of the corps and told him to just go train troops in India. Yet he still tries to blame Slim for what's happened here. He's the one that ends up losing his job. Slim gets promoted, and this is where the 14th Army is created. Okay, after this event, to make a break between the previous army and the new army that's learning these lessons in the second half of 1943. But I should say, sorry, this was January, February 1943 we're talking about. And it is the catalyst for both infantry training, logistics, and armour, and how they're all going to work together that will then be important. Well, it will be crucial in 1944 in the defensive battles, but it will really come to be what's the right word here? It will be the game changer in 1945.
But is the other game changer at this point is when the grants start arriving at the same time, which oddly is suited to Burma, isn't it? Because you mentioned it's only the 2-pounder, which is not particularly a bunker buster on the Valentines.
Yeah, absolutely. The Grant tank is, and I made this argument in the book. The Grant tank has a lot of haters out there. Grant and Lee tanks. The difference between the Lee, because this often comes up, you have the Lee tank. The Lee tank.
I had to pause because I couldn't remember which was which. The Lee's the American, isn't it?
Well, I mean, they're both technically American, but the difference is.
But one's to a British spec.
Yes, yeah, exactly right. So the Lee tank has 7 crewmen. The radio operator is down in the hull next to the driver. Sort of if you're inside the tank, the front left. Whereas in the Grant tank, to fit British doctrine, the tank radio is moved up into the turret, where you would find it in any other British tank, and also the Sherman tanks. So they've moved it up into the turret. They've put a little blister on the back of the turret. The turret also has a slightly lower profile than on the Lee turret. And the radio operator in the front has been removed. So the Grant has only 6 crew members. And now officially the tank commander is supposed to use the radio, but they delegate it normally to the loader, who actually then ends up being sort of the signaller. Simply because, again, you don't want to overwork your commander because they're really the eyes as well as the decision-making heart of it. But yeah, they're beginning to arrive at this point, sort of just after this. This is where the Lee and Grant tank finds its home. To put it this way, in 1942, they're already beginning to realise they're no use in the desert. 1943 in particular, they know it's obsolete against German weapons. Whereas they're still being used against the Japanese in 1945, and the Japanese don't have a real credible answer to it because it's got good enough armour for who it's facing. I mentioned earlier we should talk about Japanese anti-tank capability at some point. It's perfectly capable of facing most Japanese anti-tank tactics, but also because it has that large crew, because it's got the 75mm general purpose gun, so that can fire high explosive and armour piercing, because it's got the 37mm that can also fire both, because it's the American one. It's slightly smaller than the 2-pounder gun, but it's comparable, but it's more flexible in terms of its ammunition types, and it's still got 2 30 caliber Browning machine guns, and so it's capable of firing at multiple different directions, something that, say, the Valentine tank couldn't. And it has a large enough crew, so it has the bandwidth to do these multiple different things. You've got the gunner and the loader of the 75mm. They can worry about what's going on with the bunker busting, whilst the gunner and the loader of the 37mm can worry about close defence from Japanese advances.
So we're bringing those in now. I presume they were coming in partly reused from the desert as they're getting Shermans. We're getting tanks that are not necessarily wanted everywhere else. So potentially there's not a bad supply of armoured vehicles, is there, to the Far East at that point?
Yeah, they do. Because the Americans have made so many of them, because they thought they needed to, there are plenty of them about. It's why there are Lees first. So what you find is the tank regiments like the 25th Dragoons, the 3rd Carabiniers, they receive their Lee tanks in 1943. And they're the ones that do the first real training with the lessons of Burma in mind. So hill climbing, sort of jungle warfare, bunker busting in particular, because that's the big lesson from 1943. You have to destroy Japanese bunkers if you're going to get anywhere. So they arrive then, and it's later units. So the 149th, 150th Regiment of the Royal Armoured Corps, they're both the ones that arrive and they get Grant tanks. And then the later units get Sherman tanks. And so you get these different things. Obviously, the reduced crew in a Grant is also an advantage to manpower-hungry British regiments, because it's difficult to find a British replacement compared to an Indian Army replacement. So when British Army tank units in 1944, the Grant is seen as a better idea because there's fewer people that need replacing. If you take casualties in a tank, say a tank burns out and kills 7 crew, that's 1 more man. And if you have multiple of that, luckily it becomes less of a problem than anticipated. But it was the reason why they wanted Grant tanks, partly because it's a smaller crew, better for your manpower worries in the long term.
So we're not standing still. We've got new kit coming in. You have alluded to Japanese anti-tank measures. Are they moving forward with new ideas, new kit to deal with our improved armour?
No, this is the thing. The Japanese are horrifically passive in the Burma campaign in general. Part of this is economic. So they have the problems of the American blockade by submarine, and also as it comes online, then the American bomber offensive against Japan. And so it makes it harder and harder, not just to send newer weapons to the front, but it becomes harder and harder to develop new technologies, improving technologies. So those 37 and 47 millimeter anti-tank guns that were being used in 1942 against the Stuarts of 7th Armoured Brigade are still being used against Probyn's Horse, Deccan Horse in 1945. And they haven't brought anything bigger online. The only other thing they do have, and again, this isn't a new technology, their 75 millimeter artillery piece is a bit like the 25 pounder. It can fire armor piercing shot. But because it's also an artillery piece, it doesn't have the same velocity that you'd really want. And so whilst it can do a job, it's not the big threat like, say, an 88 millimeter in the Western theatres would be to these tanks. And so the Japanese fall back on suicide tactics, explosive acids, even Molotov cocktails. And even in 1945, and I recount this in the book, a Japanese officer climbs on the back of a 3rd Carabiniers tank, kills the tank commander with his samurai sword, climbs inside the tank and kills the loader, and then has a hand-to-hand fight.
Is this Vernon Jenkins?
Vernon Jenkins, yeah. And the sword that the Japanese officers used is still at the Scottish Dragoon Guards Museum in Edinburgh Castle.
Yeah, so hang on. So the Japanese, he kills the tank commander.
Who's out of the tank. He's climbed up the back of the tank and kills the tank commander who's got his head out of the thing. Now, Louis Allen and the DLI official history, because they were fighting alongside the 2nd Battalion Durham Light Infantry, they both say that Hubert Cornaby, the tank commander, was beheaded. He's not. Both of those are second-hand stories. The after-action report in March 1945 in the 3rd Carabiniers War Diary quite clearly states that the sword was plunged into Cornaby. So he was stabbed, presumably from behind in the back, through his body, and collapses down inside. There's no evidence, no comment whatsoever from the after-action contemporary report that he was beheaded. That's when he climbs into the tank. He kills the loader and then has the hand-to-hand fight with Jenkins, who gets the military medal.
In the tank?
Inside the tank turret.
With 2 other dead bodies around him already. I mean, the confined space must have made any form of fighting difficult.
I went into a Grant tank turret, and it was a Grant tank that this took place in. There's a very, very rusty one that's been recently... it was a range target, formerly a range target. And it was at Tank Fest this year, and I persuaded them basically to let me go inside it. And it is a small turret. It is smaller than the Sherman turret.
I've got my samurai sword. Can I climb in it, please, and see what it feels like?
Yeah. Or just, do you know what? Just taking like a meter ruler, like a teacher's meter ruler. That's not even as long, and that would have been difficult to try and use. The reason why the Jenkins, he's on the far side of the turret hatch. So the 37 millimeter gun breach is between him and the Japanese officer. And that's essentially why the Japanese officer can't really maneuver the sword. The crazy thing is Jenkins empties his revolver, so he fires 6 rounds, and he then picks up the dead loader's revolver, somehow manages in the melee to get to that point where he can take the loader's gun out of his holster from his body on the floor to then shoot the Japanese officer. So he's fired 6 rounds inside a turret.
Presumably misses.
Or at least hasn't killed or done enough to stop that Japanese officer. Like, honestly, whilst I know I haven't discovered this, I'm not saying I discovered this story, but reading that after-action report, which clearly Louis Allen in his like doorstop of a book, and also the 2nd Durham Light Infantry, which is what he references, they've not got the detail right. It's almost not quite a footnote, but in both of them, it's a quick thing. It was the most incredible thing. I actually had it's goosebumps and hair standing on end when I read that report, because I knew that there must be something there. And it was one of those dates, 2nd of March 1945, that I went to straight away to find out what happened. And I couldn't believe there was this 2-page document that went into the level of detail I'm talking about, more than the previous books that just said a guy got killed with a sword kind of thing.
Oh, well, it's all just a bit nuts, any form of sort of hand-to-hand cat fighting with dead bodies all in there. And it shows the desperation, I guess, of them just jumping on the tanks to try and take them out, because they have no other option with their anti-tank weapons that are very effective. I assume what charges and bombs they had were few and far between, spread amongst their units.
Yeah, so going a year earlier than that, going back to February 1944, so the Battle of the Admin Box, when the Japanese tried to attack the tanks there using suicide tactics, because they really didn't think there would be any tanks there. So the Battle of the Admin Box is in Arakan again. So it's coastal jungle, although it's on the far side of the mountains to when we were talking about Donbass earlier. So it's not literally coastal. The region is coastal, but the fighting is not taking place near the coast. It's sort of dried up paddy field where the admin box is. And the Japanese have to cross this paddy to get to the tanks at night. So the way that the admin box plays out is the Japanese try to attack at night when they have advantages, and then the day is spent clearing the Japanese off of any gains they've made, whether that's mountains at the edges of the jungle or if they've made it partway across the paddy. The paddy field in front of the box did have a very shallow chung with a few trees dotted along it, sort of halfway across it. The whole defence of the admin box in this area was built around the fact that they lined up the two squadrons of the 25th Dragoons at the sort of the inside edge of the admin box, facing over the paddy. And basically, the moment there's any movement in front of them, the tanks were lined up on, like their guns were on fixed lines. So they were pre-arranged interlocking fields of fire that the tanks would fire across, so that any Japanese crossing the paddy would at some point have to pass through a stream of bullets or canister shot from the 37mm, because they didn't have enough infantry to man the entire perimeter. So firepower is used to basically cover the paddy field with fire. And the moment there's any movement in front of them, the order is given and all the tanks open fire. And, this happens most nights. But what they discover is the Japanese never get close enough. The defense is that well, like the field of fire that they've put in place is so good. The Japanese never make it across the paddy field. But when they look at the bodies in the daytime, they find that a lot of them are carrying, suicide bombs, that sort of thing. And what they do is when they have a tank that is damaged beyond repair in the admin box, they take some of the Japanese suicide bombs and they basically fix them to the side and then detonate them from a distance to test how much damage they can do. And what they find is basically, unless they got them on or under the rear engine deck, or the rear of the engine deck, where there's I don't know if anyone knows the back end of a Sherman or a Lee tank, Lee or Grant, because they're all roughly the same. They have a double door for access to the thing. So, sort of on top of the engine deck and behind it is basically the vulnerability, even to these suicide bombs. So even the side armour, it will dent it, it will push it in. It might cause some splash on the inside that could cause casualties, but they're not going to breach and blow it up, is what they learn at the admin box. And all of this feeds into how tanks get used in the future, because they realise by the end of the Battle of the Admin Box, because the Japanese also bring up a couple of anti-tank guns that they drag through the forest in the second half of the Admin Box battle, they realise that the tanks, they're relatively impervious to fire. So at the Admin Box, the tanks that are properly destroyed are freak incidences. So I've forgotten the name of the guy that was in the tank now. Wally Mole. Is the loader of a 75mm gun, where basically a mortar round lands on the hatch above his head, directly above the 75mm gun. The hatch is open because they've kind of begun to get there's a little bit of complacency, I think. They're firing from the paddy into the hillsides, where the infantry are basically reporting on. The big thing they do, this is actually really big changes. What they have is the infantry right inside facing the bunker. They are using radios to another infantry officer that's behind the tank, who is using a telephone intercom. And so there's radio to telephone into the tank. And this is sort of the big thing that's come forward, sort of the beginning of this fighting, that the communication between infantry and tanks is what needed to be improved. And it's while they're doing one of these operations, they think they're relatively safe inside inside the paddy, firing into the tree line, when a 1 in a million mortar shell lands basically on the edge of the open turret hatch. And what had happened is Wally Mole had laid out his cordite charges. And so the explosion that kills 3 or 4 of the crew, 3 or 4 are badly burned. There's a flash fire, a bit like what you'd find on like a Royal Navy vessel. And the thing is, it's so hot in Burma that the guys are wearing just their shorts. And so the cordite goes up in like a whoomph rather than a concentrated explosion. There's a flash of fire. The multiple eyewitnesses talk about this big yellow puff of smoke. which is the cordite going off as a flash fire rather than an explosion. That's what burns them all. Wally Mole and his gunner are killed, 2 more dive wounds later. But that's a 1 in a million freak shot of it landing near enough inside an open hatch. The second one is when a Zero drops a bomb and lands next to a tank that then rolls forward, and Gordon Haynes, one of the people I follow in the book, he jumps on it, and he's clearly he doesn't make it clear in his own memoirs, but I think he's really badly affected by this moment, because he has to be dragged away, and he becomes sort of obsessed with trying to rescue someone that's actually already been rescued, and he's kind of pulled away. You know, he's got burns from the thing and things like that. But basically, they're 1 in a million shots. You know, John Lane, one of the other tank crew in 25th Dragoons at the admin box, he describes the tanks going into action, doing their day's work, and coming back into the admin box in the afternoon. And when they had to go through a place called Tattenham Corner, the left-hand bend at Epsom Downs racecourse, which is also famous for Emily Davison, it's where she jumped in front of the horse for the suffragette movement. It's a left-hand bend in a road that is roughly the same angle. The Japanese had put a 37mm gun overlooking that, but because it couldn't hit the frontal armour properly and damage it, the tanks have all got these little silver conical indents all over the front, whereas they've driven through and back, but they can't damage it. You know, they do kill. There's a famous communist called Clive Branson who had fought in the Spanish Civil War, who had then been called up and joined and ended up in the 25th Dragoons. He's killed by one of these 37mm ones. He was a sergeant tank commander. And again, it's a 1 in a million shot. He's got his head out the tank and an armor-piercing shot hits him in the back of the head. But they don't have the ability to destroy these tanks. And at the admin box, they really, really realise this, and realise with the Lee tank and then the Grant and then the Sherman, we've got the kit now that will decisively operate against the Japanese, because it's got a big enough crew, it's got a huge amount of firepower. The 75mm, it's flexible and it's so accurate that you can get, and this is what they've been testing at the end of 1943, you can get infantry to within about 10 yards of a Japanese bunker and still be safely firing. You know, you start with high explosive rounds, and if you haven't still destroyed it, you still pump the Japanese bunker with armor piercing, because that sounds no different to a normal one. So it will keep the Japanese suppressed until the last minute. They're 10 yards away, and then the infantry can move in with kukri, machine gun, grenades.
Jack, we're going to pause it there, folks. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Jack Bowsher, and we're discussing tank warfare in Burma. Slim's big idea is when he goes in the offensive is the defensive boxes. Well, I was going to say, for those people who are not aware of how the boxes work, what were the boxes? But how does armour fit into the boxes and the offensive that Slim then launches in? I'm dreadful on the year. I really struggle with the years with a timeline with Burma, because it always happens a lot later than I think. Was that 44?
So yeah, it's defensive battles in 1944, and then the offensive battles in 1945.
But they're defensive boxes that he goes on the offensive with, which is a just brilliant idea.
Yeah. So the basic lesson of earlier in the war had been, we talked about in 1942, the Japanese getting onto your supply lines, and your doctrine was to break out of that encirclement. Now, they didn't have the air power to resupply in 1942. I mean, they had 8 Blenheim bombers in 1942 and like a handful of fighters and things like that. They're not in a very good position air power wise, and they lose, like the Japanese have dominance of the air at that point. So they weren't in a position to try this anyway. And also in 1943, after the failures at Donbass, the Japanese had done a similar thing. They'd got Japanese troops over the Arakan Mountains and behind the British there as well. So they end up having another retreat in 1943, which is less well known. But, you know, an entire infantry brigade is destroyed in that, 3,000 men is basically destroyed. They realise that as they get more air power, because of Lend-Lease kicking in, because of the seriousness of the Americans wanting to open the Burma Road, and therefore the importance of the Burma campaign to the Americans, means that they are happy to do this. It's worth saying nearly 300,000 Americans serve in the Burma campaign. But almost every single one of them is logistical and engineers and that sort of thing, or pilots and that sort of thing. The Merrill's Marauders is the only large unit, and it's 3,000 men. But there's only 3,000 men. You've got very few American combat personnel. So the whole point is that they realise that the Japanese always get onto your supply line, so you need to protect your supplies in some way. Because of the increased amount of air power that's come in, what Slim's sort of bold idea is, you drop supplies to those places, and you also then deny those supplies to the Japanese. One of the things when the Japanese did these hooks, when the British retreated, the Japanese are relying on what they called Churchill rations. When the British retreat, they're always going to leave stuff behind. So that's how you maintain your advance. Now, famously at Imphal and Kohima, the Japanese troops invading in March 1944 at Imphal and Kohima further north, they are attacking with 20 days rations, but they end up fighting for 5 months. And they don't capture large supply dumps that they were planning to capture. So they then have to improvise their own supply lines that they weren't expecting to rely on. They knew they'd have to bring some supplies over the mountains, but they weren't going to. And so these defensive boxes, which, you ask what they actually are, essentially, you make these series of boxes, and it's an idea taken from the desert fighting, which hadn't always been a big success, but they thought it would work better here because it's a slower moving battle normally in Burma because of the geographical difficulties compared to the desert. So what you have is it's infantry on the perimeters. You've got wire entanglements, maybe booby traps if you've got a chance to put them in, mines if you've got a chance to put them in, but they don't always have that opportunity. You have aggressive patrolling from that box to make sure that you don't get surprised by anything. You have your brigade or divisional firepower in the middle of the boxes. If it's a smaller box, maybe at battalion level, you've got your mortars and other heavy weapons in the middle of the box. All-round defence. And then you're resupplied by air. And it's tested first. Well, the Chindits do it first, actually, in Operation Longcloth. But then it's scaled up to divisional level at the Battle of the Admin Box. And then at corps level at Imphal. And the statistics are mind-blowing. Tens of millions of cigarettes, for example, are flown in. I think it's nearly 50 million cigarettes, just as an example. But they're even bringing in goats and sheep and pigs, chickens, eggs, all by air. Imphal in particular, in their hundreds of thousands, the eggs in particular.
There's a runway in Imphal, isn't there?
Yeah, there's 5 or 6.
So they're not like parachuting goats out of.
It's air landed. They're landing zones, not just drop zones. There are drop zones, and some things are dropped by.
But a lot of these admin boxes don't have landing zones, do they? They are actually airdrop. They're supplied by airdrop.
So admin box Kohima are both airdrops. Imphal has both landing zones and dropping zones. But so that's effectively what they are. And again, it's about denying the Japanese their advantages because they want to be light and fast moving, light infantry armies that are capturing supplies. Whereas the British and Americans are going to rely on the British and Indian armies are relying on firepower and logistics, which is what they do then, first at the admin box, but then at Imphal and Kohima in particular.
So how are they using the armour then? Does the armour just become static blockhouses, essentially?
So no, this is the thing again. Slim is a very active defence, and this is something that will be repeated again at Mechtiela in 1945 as well. You have your defensive box for defensive phases, but you use your tanks to go and attack the major Japanese incursions. So to take Imphal as the sort of the biggest example of this, the Imphal plain is 25 miles wide, it's 45 miles long. So we talk about an encirclement, it's a massive scale and it is porous. There isn't a single contiguous line around that perimeter. It's more like the major routes are garrisoned and firepower is used to deny certain routes. So you end up with detachments dotted around the outside. So it's not quite a continuous perimeter, but it's as near as makes possible with use of firepower to sort of cross any other bits. But what you have is whenever the Japanese make an incursion, it's like the admin box on a large scale, actually. Whenever the Japanese make an incursion, you counterattack it. And that's really where the armour plays into its own. The Japanese can make infiltrations at night, but can they hold them and then push on? Can they use lodgements? So what you find is the admin box, Slim describes this in Defeat into Victory as like a wheel, and there are spokes to this wheel. It's the roads really that come out. So the major areas of combat are to the immediate east, the direct route into Burma, famously the area around the Shenan Saddle, which is where there's the 20th Indian Division and then the 23rd Indian Division, because there's some movement later in the battle. They fight a very, very defensive battle here. So apart from when Slim retreats to the Imphal plain from the mountains, Generally speaking, what you're talking about is jungle fighting in the hills, but it's static, hold the line at the Shenam Saddle. When they retreat to the Shenam Saddle on the edge of the Imphal Plain, a squadron of 3rd Carabiniers in Lee tanks goes and helps us to escort them out. But one of the interesting things is the only large tank-on-tank battle takes place on this part. So as the 3rd Carabiniers are going to collect the units of the 20th Division, they come across a Japanese ambush where they put 7 Type 95 Hargo tanks in the jungle tree line of a clearing with infantry on the opposite side of this jungle track. And basically what happens is they ambush the tanks as they enter the clearing. They get one lucky shot and it blows up some spare fuel in jerry cans or something on the back of the Lee tank. The problem is that they've camouflaged them in this tree line and they're going to fight as pillboxes, and they don't move. So they have no initiative whatsoever. Because they don't move, the Grant tanks with and remember, this is a criticism of the Lee tank normally is, the 75mm is in a sponson, so it only has a 30-degree traverse in total. So you have to turn your tank to face your enemy. The thing is, if your Japanese tank has not got the weapon to penetrate the frontal armour, the Grant tank only ever presents its frontal armour to its target. So they turn the tank on the target, and the Japanese can do nothing. And so they just bang, 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 bang. They destroy 6 of the 7 basically in a few minutes. And the last one turns tail and basically runs. They shoot after it, but they don't manage to destroy it. It gets away. Those tanks end up back in the Imphal Plain, and they're then used for more tests on Japanese tanks. It's possibly the tank that's at the Tank Museum in Bovington in Dorset, but that could also be one from Mechatila in 1945. There's some question marks. It's one or the other. The only other one it could be is there's a Piat. One's destroyed by a Piat further south in the Imphal Plain. It's after that point the Japanese deliberately don't use any tanks against British armour again, or Indian armour. They actively avoid it, and they rely on suicide tactics or anti-tank guns, neither of which are particularly successful. So that's over to the east. This is the 17th, how's your luck, 17th Division. They get given the call to retreat to Imphal too late. And so they have to fight quite a vicious fighting retreat from Tiddim to the south into the Imphal Plain. But again, it's the 7th Light Cavalry in Stuart tanks helps bring them out. And so that's actually the retreat phase. And this is the important thing, actually. Slim knows his advantages are tank, artillery, air power. That's why he pulls these units back from the jungle into the Imphal Plain, because he knows that he'll have the advantages there and it will overstretch Japanese supplies. That's sort of the retreat phase. Then there's the defensive phase. So the Japanese make multiple incursions. They finish enclosing the Imphal Plain from all sides. And the physically closest they get to Imphal, where the main airfield is, although there's a couple of different ones, is a mountaintop called Nunshigam, which is very famous if you know where to read. You know, the Scots Dragoon Guards today still have the 13th of April as one of their regimental anniversary things. I'll say what they do in a minute, actually. So Nunshigam is about 8 miles from Imphal. It's about 5 miles from Kangla Airfield, one of the airfields that are on there. It's also the tallest thing that's closest to Imphal. So the Japanese managed to attack it in the 10th of April. They capture it over the 11th and 12th. They clear it. And it's basically like an upside down Y shape. Japanese build a load of their bunkers on the main peaks. The northern peak, called the Northern Bump, is the main Japanese position. And after a couple of days, Slim and Stopford, I think it is off the top of my head, the corps commander, decide, why don't we try and get some tanks up there? And the 3rd Carabiniers say, yeah, we reckon we can do it. They're commanded at this point by a guy called Ralph Younger, who was also in 7th Hussars in the retreat in 1942. He's the only tank officer that fights all the way through, or the only tank person that fights all the way through from 1942 to 1945. And it's really annoying because the Imperial War Museum interviewed him about mechanisation in the 1930s, but they didn't ask him about his time in Burma. And that would have been perfect for me because he's the only person that ties the whole story together. But he basically says we can get them up there. And so they take these tanks up this mountain and they do it from the 2 different parts of the Y shape. And they converge at the tallest point, which is 3,800 feet. But that's 1,000 feet off the valley floor. So it's 1,000 feet they've climbed. But it's still very, very high up. And what they do is they converge at the southern bump, which they thought was properly occupied, but they see Japanese infantry retreat. So the bunkers that were there weren't finished. And the Japanese have their main resistance on the northern bump. So the two troops of B Squadron and 3rd Carabiniers have joined up at the southern bump, the tallest point. They have to drop down a saddle to then climb back up to the northern bump. And this is where it starts to go wrong. It's a complete knife edge at the top of this ridge. It's barely a couple of meters across. And so the tank commanders aren't just having their heads out, their sort of heads and shoulders and torso are out because they've got this knife edge ridge and a 1,000-foot drop to either side. Because of the angle as well, every time they're climbing, the driver cannot see anything. He can just see sky, hence the importance of this guy. So as they approach the main Japanese position, this is when it all starts to go wrong. So the tank commanders have to resort to using grenades, pistols, and submachine guns to defend themselves as the Dogra infantry are fighting alongside them. And one by one, the tank commanders get killed. And they fall down inside their turrets. And in some cases, like the loader, because it's normally the loader that would take over, because they're on the right side of the 77 millimeter breach. A couple of them also get killed, climbing out and trying to shoot, defend, and navigate and pick targets. Like often happens, the infantry kind of slightly falling behind the tanks because of the fighting. Now they are clearing. There are slit trenches on the hillside either side of them. It's really perilous stuff, and the attack sort of begins to bog down, and they realise that there are no officers left in the Dogra infantry or the B Squadron's troops, 4 and 5 troop. James Craddock, the squadron sergeant major, is the last tank commander left. He's right at the back. He then has a meeting with Subedar Ranbir Singh, who is the leader of the Dogras now that there's no officers left. A Subedar is an equivalent to a Sergeant in the Indian Army, yeah. They have a little meeting. They come up with one final attack to try and get 2 tanks around the outside. And, again, we're talking about a knife edge. This is really, really difficult driving to clear this. And he drives his own tank up onto the middle Japanese bunker and then drops down to destroy the ones on the far side. They managed to clear it just under these non-commissioned officers. And I mentioned the Scottish Dragoon Guards. Even today, they celebrate this by having they have a big national parade, but none of the officers are in charge. It's all done by the NCOs.
So if Slim's plan is defensive boxes and sallying out, right? So logistically, if you're thinking of the Chindits and they're supplied from the air, that's fine. Supplying infantry from the air, one thing. Presumably, you need to have the logistical support to support tanks flown in from the air. Now, if you haven't got an airfield, how feasible was it to logistically support tanks from the air? Because there's fuel, engine parts. I don't know how big you could fit on a plane to sort of somehow get in. And then you need presumably workshop kit as well. It's actually quite a technical process, presumably. If it's even possible, or do they just write the tanks off and get some more in?
There is some cannibalization of damaged ones. So, like a good example, Kangla Tongbi, one of the guys I follow in the book, he talks about how his tank's 75mm gun was damaged, and the engine in another tank was damaged, so they took the 75mm out and put it into their tank. So there's some cannibalization, but actually, you can break stuff down small enough to land it in a Dakota. I mean, they even did experiments in the end of 1944. They did experiments in India of disassembling a Sherman tank and carrying it in, I think it was 3 Dakotas. The limiting factor was they thought they would have too many people that would have to be reassembling them at the airfield in the forward zone. So they decided it just wasn't worth it, and they would be better putting the effort into making sure that they had good enough roads and enough tank transporters and transport. But they are dropping spare parts. So gun barrels, breeches, all of the track assemblies, engine parts, and they call it POL. When you're reading documents on this, it's POL, petrol, oil, lubricants. They're all brought in by aircraft. They can drop these by parachute as well. They pack stuff in jute packaging because there's loads of jute in India. So no, they are able to do this. So it's that mixture. There are certain limits. So tank hulls, for example, they're not going to be able to do that. So that's where the attrition is. And the attrition is a worry in Impal because it's not just that they don't have any way of getting certain spares forward because they're too vast hulls. They also flew in C Squadron of the 150th Royal Armoured Corps, and they took the reserve tanks of 3rd Carabiniers. So they don't actually have any reserve tanks either. So the attrition on the infile plane is permanent. If they write a tank off. But what that means is they make it very, very They are very, very selective with what they write off. Something in say Normandy 1944 would get written off, would not be written off in Burma. By hell or high water, they would find a way of fixing it, or at least making it good. The other problem they have is, and this is something that becomes a permanent change in the Indian Army, is because they're spreading these detachments. So the 3rd Carabiniers and 150th C Squadron of 150th Royal Army Corps, they are divvied out across in 10 different detachments. So they don't fight as a single unit, like you would expect in, say, North Africa or in Western Europe. They are penny packeted, even though that's what Slim says you should never do. But the reality is you have to, that there is no way of getting around it if you're going to fight effectively. But also, if you're willing to do one of the things you said was a central tenet of your doctrine, don't penny packet armour, and you then don't take huge amounts of attrition, and then they are successful wherever they go, that shows you how important that tank has become. You know, one troop of tanks makes a huge difference in a way that it wouldn't have made a difference in North Africa or Western Europe, because one troop of tanks probably wouldn't have been enough to make a difference. Whereas in Burma, it can make a massive difference. And that's why they get sent to all these things. They're sent to Nunshigum, they're sent to Kanglatongbi. They go south to Potseng Bang, like all the soldiers call it pots and pans, and Bishanpur. You know, they send all the tanks. And again, it's that firefighting thing I mentioned in 1942. When the Japanese make an incursion, what's the lever that Slim and the others pull? It's the armour thing. The tank is the thing that goes in and then does the pushing of the Japanese away. And that fighting at Bishanpur to the south is actually the trickiest, because it's down there. It's on the floodplain from the mountains into Logtak Lake, which is a big lake that's in the middle. It's very marshy in places. It was easy for the Japanese to canalise the tanks, but over open ground. Because in the jungle, it's easy to canalise a tank, but you can't necessarily see or hear it coming because of the undergrowth. Whereas at Bishanpur and further south at Ningtakong and at Pots and Pans, Potsambang, the Japanese are able to canalise and then actually use their anti-tank guns in the flanks. So they have a little bit more success, but everything's relative. A little bit more success is they are immobilising some tanks, but they're not destroying them. It becomes Japanese doctrine, by the way. The Japanese doctrine for attacking tanks is you don't just immobilise it, you then still, even if it's empty, you have to attack it with the same vigour you would have done to destroy it, because it will be recovered. Because the British and Indian units recover it, and then it gets recycled back into the battle. So the Japanese doctrine is you don't just destroy it, you keep attacking it until you've burnt it out completely and made it completely unusable. And the trouble is they just don't manage to immobilise enough to then follow up that to make a significant dent. So whilst the 3rd Carabiniers are always worried about attrition, it actually never becomes a problem. Not in a truly decisive way. They're never withdrawn from the battle, for example, in certain places to conserve their energy for emergencies. They are used where they're needed, every time they're needed.
Very good. Well, thanks, Jack. It is a great topic and one which has been overlooked. Loyal listener, if you want to know more about tank warfare in Burma, the book is Forgotten Armour. As ever, I will put a link on the website and in the show notes. For patrons of the podcast, I'll have a little more of Jack and I chatting. If you are not already a patron, you can sign up at patreon.com/WW2podcast. I think next time I'm having a chat with Sean Scullion, who I caught with at We Have Ways Fest, where he was giving a talk on Middle East commandos. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.